Out in the Philippine Sea, a colossal amphibious assault vessel is currently cutting through the water at maximum velocity. Aboard the massive 85,000-ton warship, aviation mechanics are rushing across the windswept flight deck in the early dawn hours. They are finalizing pre-flight routines for a squadron of advanced stealth fighter jets specifically designed for short takeoffs. These sophisticated aircraft are having their noses aligned toward the southwest, aiming directly for the Persian Gulf. They are heading toward the incredibly narrow 21-mile-wide maritime corridor that has suddenly become the most fiercely contested location on the entire globe. This deployment is far from a standard patrol. A massive expeditionary strike group is currently underway, carrying approximately 2,200 heavily armed troops across 3 sophisticated naval warships. Alongside the primary assault ship, a guided missile cruiser and a guided missile destroyer are providing a heavily fortified escort. The aerial component features an array of tiltrotor aircraft alongside the advanced stealth fighters, creating a highly mobile intervention force. This massive maritime mobilization is the direct result of a rapidly deteriorating security environment that has captured the anxious attention of the entire international community. To understand the gravity of this naval movement, it is necessary to look back exactly 2 weeks to the dramatic initiation of an unprecedented military campaign. In the middle of the night, a presidential broadcast officially announced the beginning of major combat operations aimed at a Middle Eastern adversary. This joint, multinational military endeavor was explicitly designed to comprehensively dismantle decades of accumulated military infrastructure. The primary objectives included the systematic destruction of advanced missile networks, formidable naval assets, and deeply entrenched underground nuclear research facilities in a single, overwhelming wave of aerial bombardments. The very first moments of this coordinated military strike delivered a profoundly disruptive outcome that the international intelligence community had not entirely predicted. The supreme spiritual and political leader of the targeted nation, who had maintained absolute authority for over 3 decades, was killed in the opening barrage. In the immediate aftermath of this monumental leadership decapitation, the usually vocal and defiant administration fell completely silent. For nearly 6 hours, state media networks ceased broadcasting their standard aggressive rhetoric, leading to intense global speculation about the immediate stability and operational capacity of the ruling government. That temporary silence, however, was not an indication of capitulation or institutional paralysis, but rather a period of intense strategic reorganization. When the nation's elite military guard finally issued a formal statement, they bypassed conventional military retaliation in favor of launching an asymmetrical economic offensive. They initiated a comprehensive strategy deliberately designed to strangle global commerce by effectively rendering the world's most vital energy corridor completely impassable. This highly calculated pivot from direct military confrontation to devastating financial warfare immediately began to reshape the fundamental dynamics of the ongoing conflict and the international economy. The impact of this economic strategy on commercial maritime traffic has been nothing short of catastrophic. Recent maritime tracking data reveals that shipping through this critical strait has virtually evaporated amid the escalating hostilities. Only a few dozen vessels have managed to transit the waterway this month, representing a staggering 94% collapse compared to the thousands of transits recorded during the same period the previous year. This sudden evaporation of traffic is particularly devastating, considering this specific geographic choke point historically facilitates more than a quarter of the entire planet's daily maritime petroleum trade. The brilliance of this maritime blockade lies in its entirely non-traditional execution. The governing regime has not physically chained the waterway shut, nor have they visibly seeded the navigable channels with explosive mines. Instead, they have weaponized the global maritime insurance industry to accomplish what physical barricades could not. Because the threat of attacks is so pervasive, international underwriters are completely refusing to issue war risk policies for commercial tankers attempting the passage. Without this mandatory financial protection, major shipping conglomerates absolutely refuse to risk their highly valuable crews and billion-dollar vessels in the contested waters. The perceived danger in these waters is far from theoretical, as multiple commercial entities have already suffered devastating consequences. More than a dozen international merchant vessels have faced direct attacks while navigating the strait and its immediately adjoining waters over the past 2 weeks. These aggressive interceptions have resulted in multiple fatalities among civilian seafarers, with several crew members still officially unaccounted for following a severe fire aboard a Southeast Asian cargo ship. Despite formal diplomatic protests being lodged at the highest levels, the targeted vessel remained ablaze for days, highlighting the severe operational risks. The newly appointed supreme leader, stepping into the immense power vacuum left by his father's sudden death, immediately reinforced this aggressive maritime posture. In his inaugural public address, he explicitly confirmed that blocking the vital shipping lane is a deliberate mechanism intended to maximize economic suffering for Western adversaries. The military apparatus supporting him has openly declared that any commercial vessel demonstrating even a tangential connection to allied nations will be treated as a legitimate military target. Their publicly stated objective is to intentionally drive the global price of crude oil to unprecedented, catastrophic levels. This coordinated economic disruption strategy generated immediate and extreme volatility across global energy exchanges. The benchmark price for crude oil skyrocketed from a stable $70 per barrel to well over $100 in a matter of days, exhibiting wild fluctuations as the conflict showed zero signs of de-escalation. Senior financial officials have openly admitted that these supply chain interruptions erased billions of dollars from the domestic economy in under 14 days. This massive financial hemorrhage is rapidly transitioning from a distant geopolitical abstraction into a painful reality affecting household grocery budgets and transportation costs. Faced with these severe economic realities, the unified international front has begun to quietly fracture behind closed doors. Rather than waiting for a comprehensive military resolution, several prominent Western nations are actively pursuing independent diplomatic solutions to secure their own energy lifelines. Key European allies have initiated unpublicized back-channel communications directly with the heavily sanctioned regime to negotiate safe transit for their specific national fleets. This pragmatic approach highlights the desperate lengths to which economically pressured governments will go to ensure their domestic stability, even if it requires dealing directly with an active military adversary. The targeted nation has recognized this fracture and is applying a highly selective approach to its maritime blockade. By intentionally granting safe passage to vessels originating from specific Asian and European nations while strictly attacking Allied connected ships, the regime is executing a masterclass in division. Every bilateral agreement forged between the blockading nation and a desperate foreign government serves as a direct blow to the overarching international pressure campaign. This calculated selectivity demonstrates that the regime is operating with precise strategic clarity, methodically exploiting the economic vulnerabilities of the global coalition arrayed against them. Amidst this complex diplomatic maneuvering, a massive Eastern European superpower has quietly positioned itself as the conflict's primary economic beneficiary. While their government spokespeople publicly advocate for multinational cooperation to stabilize reeling energy markets, the reality of their situation is vastly different. Because millions of barrels of Middle Eastern crude are trapped behind the blockade, desperate global consumers are being forced to purchase from alternative suppliers. Consequently, this heavily sanctioned superpower is experiencing a massive resurgence in its own energy revenues, reaping a colossal financial windfall with every single day the vital strait remains closed. The involvement of this external power has raised severe anxieties regarding the potential sharing of highly classified tactical information. During tense high-level communications, Allied diplomats could only express their sincere hope that targeting intelligence regarding military assets was not being secretly passed to the blockading regime. The individual tasked with managing these delicate diplomatic interactions was surprisingly not a seasoned foreign policy expert, but rather a prominent commercial real estate developer appointed as a special envoy. Understanding this unique personnel dynamic is absolutely crucial for comprehending the fragile negotiations that preceded the outbreak of open hostilities. The preliminary discussions aimed at preventing this massive conflict were conducted under highly unusual and deeply strained circumstances. In a stark departure from traditional diplomatic protocols, a senior regional military commander was physically seated at the negotiating table alongside the civilian envoy. The presence of a high-ranking admiral, while heavy naval assets loomed just offshore, cast a distinctly coercive shadow over the diplomatic proceedings. Furthermore, the two primary delegations completely refused to sit in the same room, forcing a neutral regional mediator to physically shuttle written proposals back and forth through the hallways of a Gulf state facility. These incredibly tense, indirect communications ultimately culminated in a dramatic failure just hours before the pre-established military deadline expired. Shortly before the aerial bombardments commenced, the targeted regime presented a comprehensive multi-page framework outlining a potential resolution to the nuclear standoff. However, the proposal was swiftly rejected because it insisted on maintaining operations at a legacy civilian research reactor utilizing moderately enriched materials. Following a heated verbal exchange regarding sovereign rights to nuclear technology, the Allied delegation abruptly departed the facility, and within 36 hours, the massive preemptive military campaign was officially authorized and forcefully executed. The primary justification provided for the sudden termination of diplomacy and the initiation of combat operations centered on a highly specific and alarming intelligence metric. Negotiators claimed that the regime had successfully accumulated hundreds of kilograms of highly enriched nuclear material at a heavily fortified underground site. According to specialized assessments, this massive stockpile positioned the adversary merely days away from possessing the capability to construct a functional weapon of mass destruction. This terrifying proximity to nuclear proliferation was ultimately cited as the absolute threshold that rendered further peaceful negotiations completely unacceptable to the Allied command structure. Yet, in the chaotic aftermath of the initial aerial bombardments, a profound and deeply unsettling mystery remains entirely unresolved. Because the diplomatic delegation notably lacked specialized technical experts, there is rampant confusion regarding the actual status of that highly enriched material. While political officials confidently assert that the primary processing facilities were completely obliterated, international atomic monitors have been entirely unable to verify the permanent destruction of the dangerous stockpile. The targeted regime has deliberately maintained strict silence regarding their surviving capabilities, leaving the international community completely blind to the true effectiveness of the preemptive military strikes. This lingering uncertainty perfectly explains why the massive naval expeditionary force is currently abandoning its standard training maneuvers to accelerate toward the conflict zone. The sophisticated Marine unit now speeding across the ocean was originally engaged in routine exercises far removed from the Middle Eastern theater. Their abrupt redirection clearly indicates a massive escalation in operational planning beyond the initial reliance on high-altitude aerial bombardments. Government officials are desperately attempting to frame this massive troop movement as a routine security enhancement to prevent further panic in the global financial sectors, but the tactical realities suggest otherwise. The specific military hardware advancing toward the contested waterway reveals a capability designed for forceful territorial acquisition, not simple defensive posturing. The integration of advanced vertical takeoff stealth fighters with specialized marine infantry units provides the Allied forces with the unique ability to execute aggressive amphibious assaults. This configuration strongly suggests that military planners are actively preparing to forcibly seize and permanently hold the heavily fortified island outposts currently facilitating the maritime blockade. If these marine forces are ordered to storm those strategic geographic positions, the scope of the regional conflict will expand exponentially in a matter of hours. This arriving expeditionary group is merely one component of the most overwhelming aggregation of naval firepower ever assembled in this specific geographic region. The international coalition has completely saturated the surrounding waters with multiple full-scale carrier strike groups, each commanding dozens of advanced combat aircraft. These massive floating air bases are tightly enveloped by a dense defensive perimeter of specialized submarines, guided missile cruisers, and essential logistical support vessels. This historically unprecedented concentration of maritime military strength is a clear demonstration that Allied forces are preparing for a sustained, high-intensity confrontation spanning the entire breadth of the regional waters. Complicating this massive naval buildup is the very real threat of a completely secondary maritime conflict igniting on the opposite side of the regional peninsula. As Allied reinforcements attempt to navigate through a completely separate southern choke point, they face intense hostility from deeply entrenched militant factions fiercely loyal to the primary adversary. These well-armed proxy groups have explicitly promised to unleash a barrage of anti-ship munitions against any Allied vessel attempting to transit their local waters. This highly volatile situation creates the terrifying prospect of Allied naval forces fighting two simultaneous, full-scale maritime wars at opposite ends of the same theater. The urgency driving these massive military preparations is deeply rooted in the catastrophic mathematical realities of prolonged global energy deprivation. If the primary maritime corridor remains completely inaccessible, the international market suffers an immediate and irreplaceable deficit of millions of barrels of crude oil every single day. Analysts project that a sustained closure will inevitably force global benchmark prices to double, translating directly to crippling fuel costs for everyday consumers. Furthermore, financial institutions are warning that such an extreme and prolonged energy shock would trigger a devastating double-digit contraction across major global equity markets, wiping out immense wealth. The economic devastation extends far beyond traditional petroleum products, directly threatening the fundamental energy stability of entire continents. A massive percentage of the world's liquefied natural gas supply relies entirely on safe transit through this heavily contested bottleneck. Following devastating drone strikes that completely paralyzed key regional extraction facilities, major European nations are suddenly facing a catastrophic secondary energy crisis, with alternative distribution pipelines entirely incapable of accommodating the massive supply deficit. Several heavily industrialized nations are already preparing to implement draconian civilian energy rationing protocols before the crucial summer cooling season even begins. In the shadows of this escalating crisis, an Eastern industrial powerhouse is quietly attempting to leverage its massive geopolitical influence to force a resolution. Relying heavily on imported fuel to sustain its massive manufacturing sector, this heavily populated nation views the prolonged disruption as a direct threat to its own national security. While they absolutely refuse to publicly align with Western diplomatic efforts, they are subtly applying intense economic pressure on the newly installed supreme leader behind closed doors. A sudden, unpublicized bilateral investment agreement could quietly provide the exact financial incentive necessary to ultimately dismantle the devastating blockade. However, any subtle attempts at brokering a peaceful resolution are being fiercely undermined by deeply entrenched political hardliners demanding absolute victory. Neighboring regional monarchies who have suffered through years of proxy warfare actively lobbied Allied leadership to initiate the devastating military campaign and are actively pushing for total regime degradation. Conversely, the newly installed leadership of the targeted nation faces intense domestic pressure to project unwavering strength, openly threatening to rain destruction down upon every single Allied military installation located within the surrounding territories. These completely irreconcilable political demands make any form of mutual de-escalation nearly impossible. As the massive amphibious assault ship steadily closes the distance to the contested strait, the human cost of this sprawling conflict continues to slowly mount. Allied forces have already suffered tragic personnel losses through logistical disasters, emphasizing that the chaotic friction of war claims lives far beyond the immediate front lines. The regional military command is now actively finalizing complex operational blueprints to systematically annihilate the coastal missile batteries currently enforcing the unauthorized maritime checkpoints. The rapidly approaching naval force clearly signals that the international coalition is fully prepared to shatter the catastrophic blockade through overwhelming unilateral military action.